My name is Ben Tucker, and I'm 39 years old. This happened last fall at Spruce Knob, the highest peak in West Virginia. I'd just finalized my divorce, packed up my life, and hit the road in an RV that still smelled like the dealership. I told myself this trip was about reconnecting with nature, about finding some clarity, but really I was running. Running from guilt, loneliness, and the wreckage of a life I'd built and then broken. I chose Spruce Knob because it was isolated, and isolation was exactly what I thought I needed. I didn't know the stories. I didn't know about the Devil's Rock. If I had, I'd like to think I would have turned back, but honestly, I don't know if I could have resisted. I arrived in the late afternoon, the sun slipping behind the ridge as I parked my RV at a campsite near the summit. The forest here was dense, the spruce trees standing like sentinels in the fading light. I set up a small fire and sat by it, nursing a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. That's when I met Eli. He was the kind of man who looked like he belonged in the mountains, tall, broad-shouldered, and weathered like an old oak tree. I'd stopped by the trailhead earlier to get a map, and he must have noticed the out-of-state plates on my RV because he wandered over to introduce himself. "You're new around here," he said, his voice gravelly but not unkind. "Just passing through," I replied. We talked for a while, mostly about the trails and the weather. Then, as if it were an afterthought, Eli asked, "You hear about the Devil's Rock yet?" I shook my head, curious despite myself. "It's an old legend," he said, leaning against a tree. "There's a boulder deep in the woods, smooth as glass, they say. Folks claim if you touch it, you can make a wish, but it always comes at a price." I laughed nervously. "And what's the price?" Eli's eyes darkened. "Depends. Sometimes it's your sanity, sometimes it's worse." I tried to brush it off as campfire talk, but his tone stayed with me long after he walked away. The first night was uneventful, but strange things started happening the next day. I set out on one of the trails Eli had recommended, hoping to clear my head and maybe snap a few photos. The forest was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my boots crunching on the dirt. That's when I noticed the trail veering off to the right, unmarked and overgrown. I don't know why, but I felt compelled to follow it. The path twisted through the trees, narrowing until I reached a clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a massive boulder, smooth and black, its surface glinting faintly in the dim light. Dead trees surrounded it, their branches bare and skeletal. I didn't stay long. There was something about the place that made my skin crawl. That night, the tapping started. I was lying in bed half asleep when I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping against the side of the RV. I froze, my heart pounding. It sounded like someone or something was knocking, but when I finally mustered the courage to look outside, there was nothing there. The next morning, I found small handprints in the dirt outside the RV. They were faint, but unmistakable, as if left by a child. I shook it off as my imagination, but later that day, I saw her. She was standing just off the trail, a teenage girl with pale skin and long dark hair. She wore a tattered dress that looked like something out of a history book, and her eyes were wide and pleading. "Are you lost?" I called out. She nodded, but didn't speak. I stepped toward her, but before I could get close, she turned and darted into the woods. I chased after her, shouting for her to wait, but she disappeared, leaving no trace, but a trail of faint footprints leading toward the clearing. When I returned to the RV, the unease I'd been feeling turned into something darker. I couldn't shake the girl's image from my mind, her hollow eyes, and the way she seemed to vanish into thin air. That night, I dreamed about the Devil's Rock. In the dream, the girl was sitting on the boulder, her hands resting on its smooth surface. Her voice was soft but insistent. "It can give you what you want." When I woke, I couldn't get her words out of my head. The next morning, I decided to find the boulder again. I don't know what I was expecting, answers maybe, or closure. The unmarked trail was easier to find this time, as if it had been waiting for me. The clearing was just as I remembered it, the boulder looming in the center, like some ancient monolith. The air was heavy, the kind of heaviness that presses against your chest and makes it hard to breathe. And then she appeared. The girl stood on the far side of the boulder, her expression vacant. She raised a hand, motioning for me to come closer. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. She didn't answer. Instead, she placed her hand on the boulder and whispered, "It can give you what you want." I hesitated, my heart pounding. The memory of my family, the laughter of my kids, the warmth of my ex-wife's smile flooded my mind. I hadn't seen them in months, and the thought of a second chance was intoxicating. Before I could stop myself, I reached out and touched the rock. At first, nothing happened. I felt a faint vibration beneath my fingers, but that was all. Disappointed, I returned to the RV, trying to convince myself it had been a foolish impulse. But that evening, my phone rang. It was my ex-wife. I'd been thinking about us. She said, her voice tentative, "Maybe we should talk." The weight in my chest lifted, replaced by a flicker of hope. I thought the rock had worked, that I'd been given a miracle. But the miracle came with a price. That night, the girl returned. She appeared outside the RV, her face pressed against the window. Her eyes were no longer pleading. They were dark, empty voids that seemed to suck the air from the room. "You made your wish," she whispered. "Now it's time to pay." The lights in the RV flickered, and the shadows inside began to twist and writhe. I grabbed a flashlight and stumbled outside, shouting into the darkness. "What do you want from me?" Her voice came from everywhere at once. "It's not me, it's the rock." Desperate, I raced back to the clearing. The forest seemed alive, the trees closing in around me as I ran. When I reached the boulder, it seemed larger, its surface pulsing like a living thing. The girl appeared again, her form shifting and flickering like a glitch in a video. "You can't undo it," she said, her voice echoing. "But you can stop it from taking more." I grabbed a hammer from my pack and swung it at the boulder. The impact sent a shockwave through the clearing, and the girl screamed, her voice merging with the sound of the rock cracking. The boulder split down the middle, a deafening roar echoing through the forest. The girl collapsed, her form dissolving into mist as the air grew still. When I woke the next morning, the clearing was empty. The boulder was gone, reduced to a pile of rubble. I returned to the RV and called my ex-wife, apologizing for everything. Whatever chance we had at reconciliation, I knew it had to come from me, not from some cursed rock. As I drove away from Spruce Knob, I caught a glimpse of the girl in my rearview mirror, standing among the trees. She wasn't smiling, but she wasn't angry either. She was just watching. Sometimes the things we want most come at a price too steep to pay, and sometimes we have to let go to move forward. My name is Nina Clark. I'm 32 years old, and this happened last October in Blackwater Falls State Park, West Virginia. I had just landed my first solo freelance assignment, a travel feature for an outdoor magazine. It was my chance to prove to myself, and maybe to a few others, that I could thrive on my own after leaving a toxic relationship. I didn't expect the park's breathtaking beauty to be marred by whispers of the past, or that those whispers would grow louder with each passing night. When I first arrived, the park was everything I'd hoped for. My RV fit snugly into a secluded campsite overlooking the gorge. The roar of the falls constant in the distance. Blackwater Falls was a photographer's dream. Cascading water, mist rising through the gorge, and vibrant autumn foliage painted in fiery reds and oranges. The first day was perfect. I hiked, shot hundreds of photos, and scribbled notes about the trails and wildlife. The peace and quiet were a bomb, exactly what I needed after months of turmoil. That evening, I sat by the fire, sipping tea and scrolling through my shots. That's when I saw it for the first time. At the edge of one frame, a figure stood between two trees. It was a man, his clothes ragged and his face shadowed. I frowned, zooming in, but the details remained blurred. I didn't remember seeing anyone during my hike, and the figure hadn't appeared in any other photos. I shook it off as an optical illusion, probably a trick of light and shadows, and went to bed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The second day brought strange encounters. I started the morning by stopping at the visitors center, hoping to get some local insight. The woman behind the counter, Maggie, was friendly, but seemed to be watching me too closely. She eyed my camera gear and smiled knowingly. "Planning to photograph the falls?" she asked. "That's the idea," I replied. Maggie hesitated, her smile faltering. "Be careful around the falls, especially near dusk. The dead don't like company." I blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me?" Before I could ask more, she turned to help another guest, leaving me with a vague unease. Later, on a trail to the falls, I ran into Gary, a park ranger. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a weathered face and a genial demeanor. As he gave me a quick overview of the park's history, I brought up Maggie's warning. He chuckled, "Oh, that's just local folklore." Back in the Civil War, there was a Confederate soldier who hid out in the gorge. They say he deserted his regiment and was hunted down near the falls. Some folks claim his spirit never left, but I've worked here for years and never seen a thing." I tried to laugh with him, but his words stayed with me. That evening, the first real sign of something unnatural occurred. I set up my tripod near the falls, hoping to capture the golden hour light. As I framed the shot, my breath caught. The air around me had turned frigid, my breath fogging in front of me, despite the mild weather. My camera refused to focus, the lens shuddering as if something was blocking it. And then, faint but unmistakable, I heard whispers. I spun around, expecting to see other hikers, but I was alone. The whispers grew louder, overlapping and indecipherable, like a crowd speaking just out of earshot. The unease became unbearable, and I packed up in a rush, leaving the falls as the last light of day faded. That night, back at the RV, I reviewed the day's photos. Most were stunning. The falls bathed in warm golden light, but in 3 of them, the figure from the previous day appeared again. This time he was closer, standing at the edge of the water. His face was clearer now, pale, gaunt, with dark hollows where his eyes should have been. And in the last photo, he was staring directly at the camera. I slammed my laptop shut and locked the RV door. The next morning, I debated cutting the trip short, but a part of me couldn't let it go. I'd always prided myself on being rational, and I wasn't going to let a few strange occurrences ruin my assignment. While hiking near the falls, I noticed an overgrown side trail. Curiosity tugged at me, and I followed it, ducking beneath low-hanging branches. It led to a clearing where the air felt heavier, almost oppressive. In the center of the clearing was a patch of disturbed earth, as though something had been buried there long ago. Nearby, I found an object half buried in the dirt, a weathered leather journal. The pages were brittle but legible, written in a looping, old-fashioned script. The entries told the story of a Confederate soldier who had deserted his regiment and fled into the gorge. His words were filled with fear and desperation. The nights grow colder, and I hear them coming. I cannot outrun my fate. The last entry read, "They will find me tonight. I will not see another sunrise." I closed the journal, my hands trembling. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the oppressive feeling returned. The RV's lights flickered, and shadows danced across the walls, moving in ways that didn't match the firelight outside. And then I saw him. The soldier stood at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the firelight. He didn't move, didn't blink, but his hollow eyes locked onto mine. My chest tightened with fear as I realized he wasn't alone. Shadows emerged from the trees, darker and more twisted, their forms writhing like smoke. They whispered accusations, voices overlapping in a cacophony. "Traitor, coward. You will not leave." Panicking, I grabbed the journal and held it up. "Is this what you want?" I shouted. The soldier's expression shifted. Sadness, perhaps gratitude, and he gestured toward the disturbed earth I'd seen earlier. I understood. Clutching the journal, I ran back to the clearing. The shadows followed, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. My hands shook, as I placed the journal on the grave and whispered a quiet prayer for peace. The air around me grew still. The shadows stopped, their forms dissolving into the night. The soldier lingered for a moment longer, his hollow eyes softening before fading into the mist. By morning, the oppressive feeling had lifted. The forest seemed brighter, the air lighter, and for the first time in days, I felt safe. Before leaving, I stopped at the visitor's center to return the journal. Maggie was there, her knowing smile greeting me. "You helped him, didn't you?" she asked, her voice soft. I nodded, unsure how to respond. She reached out, patting my hand. "He's free now. You did a good thing." As I drove away from Blackwater Falls, I realized the experience had changed me. I didn't have all the answers, but I no longer felt the weight of doubt and fear that had followed me into the park. Sometimes the past lingers in ways we can't explain, and sometimes all it takes to move forward is to lay it to rest. My name is Ryan Matthews. I'm a retired firefighter, and this happened in Seneca Creek backcountry, West Virginia, a year after I lost my wife, Emily. I'd planned the trip hoping to find peace, or at least distraction, in nature. What I found was something I can never forget. It started as a simple RV camping trip, my first time alone. Emily and I had always loved the outdoors, and this seemed like a way to reconnect with that part of my life. Seneca Creek, with its waterfalls and isolation, felt like the perfect place to be alone with my thoughts. I told myself the solitude would help, that it was what I needed. I wasn't ready for what came next. The drive into the backcountry was uneventful. The gravel road leading to the campsite felt endless, hemmed in by towering trees that cast long shadows even in the midday sun. I stopped at a small gas station near the turnoff, where an older woman named Marlene ran the counter. "You're heading into Seneca Creek?" she asked, as I paid for firewood and a few snacks. I nodded. "Yeah, just me and the RV." Marlene gave me a strange look, her hand pausing over the register. "Be careful out there," she said, her voice low. "These woods aren't always kind to those traveling alone." I wanted to ask what she meant, but she turned away to help another customer. Her words lingered in my mind as I drove the final stretch. The campsite by Judy Springs was everything I'd hoped for: quiet, picturesque, and completely isolated. I parked the RV near the creek, the sound of rushing water a soothing backdrop as I unpacked. That first night I sat by the fire, sipping coffee and staring at the stars. For the first time in months, I felt calm. The first sign that something wasn't right came the next evening. The day had been perfect. I hiked to Seneca Falls, taking photos and jotting notes in a journal I'd started since Emily's death. I even smiled a few times, thinking about how much she would have loved the view. But as I headed back to camp, a strange feeling crept over me. The woods were too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my boots on the trail. When I reached the RV, the unease deepened. My firewood, neatly stacked by the pit, was scattered across the ground. At first, I thought an animal had gotten into it, but the pieces were arranged strangely, like they'd been tossed deliberately. I shrugged it off and rebuilt the fire, telling myself I was imagining things. But that night, as I sat by the flames, I saw it for the first time. A shadow moved between the trees. It wasn't the flicker of firelight. This was deliberate, purposeful, like someone pacing at the edge of the forest. I stood up, my heart pounding. "Hello," I called out, the sound of my own voice startling me in no response. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the trees. Nothing. But as I turned back to the fire, I caught movement in my peripheral vision. A shape, humanoid but wrong, slipped behind a tree, vanishing before I could focus on it. I slept in the RV that night, the doors locked and curtains drawn. The third day brought more unsettling signs. I woke to find muddy footprints leading from the creek to the RV. They were human-sized but elongated, the toes too long and splayed. They stopped abruptly a few feet from the door, as if whoever or whatever made them had simply vanished. That afternoon, while hiking to an overlook, I stumbled upon something even stranger, symbols carved into the rocks. They weren't like any markings I'd seen before, almost like they were burned into the stone. The air felt heavier there, as if the forest were holding its breath. I hurried back to camp, but the unease followed me. That night, the shadows returned. This time, they were closer. I sat by the fire, gripping my flashlight like a weapon. The shadowy figure appeared again, standing motionless at the edge of the trees. It was tall, too tall, and its limbs were unnaturally long. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice breaking. It didn't move. The fire flickered, the flames shrinking as if smothered by an unseen force. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight, and when I looked again, the figure was gone. By the fourth morning, I'd had enough. I packed up, determined to leave, but the RV wouldn't start. The engine cranked, but refused to turn over, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I decided to hike back to the gas station for help. I marked my trail carefully, leaving a breadcrumb of sticks and rocks so I wouldn't get lost. But the forest had other plans. No matter which direction I went, the paths looped back to my campsite. I walked for hours, my legs aching, only to find myself standing in front of the RV again. As the sun set, the shadows returned. This time, there were more of them. Figures moved through the trees surrounding the campsite, their glowing yellow eyes piercing the darkness. I barricaded myself inside the RV, clutching a flare gun I'd brought for emergencies. The shadows circled outside, their footsteps echoing unnaturally loud against the silence. Then the radio came on. Static filled the air, crackling and distorted, before a song began to play, a song I hadn't heard since Emily's funeral. It was her favorite, and hearing it now, here, made my blood run cold. Her voice followed, faint and pleading. "Ryan, leave." I stared at the radio, my hands trembling. "Emily," the voice came again, softer this time. "You have to go." The shadows closed in, their forms pressing against the windows of the RV. I fired the flare through the nearest window, the bright red light igniting the darkness. The figures recoiled, their shapes dissolving like smoke. I didn't stop to think. I grabbed the keys and tried the ignition one last time. The engine roared to life. I drove through the night, my hands white-knuckled on the wheel. The forest seemed alive, the trees bending unnaturally, as if trying to block my escape. When I finally reached the gas station, Marlene was waiting. She didn't seem surprised to see me, her expression unreadable. "You saw it, didn't you?" she asked. I nodded, unable to speak. Marlene sighed. "It's the Shadow Man. He feeds on people's grief, their fear. He doesn't kill. He traps you, keeps you lost in the dark until there's nothing left." I left West Virginia the next day, vowing never to return. The shadows are gone now, but sometimes, late at night, I hear faint footsteps outside my window, and I wonder if the Shadow Man ever truly let me go. My name is Ethan Walker, and I'm 40 years old. This happened last summer while I was investigating a viral ghost story at Devil's Backbone in West Virginia. I've spent years debunking hauntings, cryptid sightings, and so-called cursed places. It's what I do for a living, exposing frauds and hoaxes on my YouTube channel, Reality Bites. I never expected Devil's Backbone to be any different. I was wrong. I arrived at the trailhead late in the afternoon, the sunlight painting the jagged cliffs of the ridge in deep orange hues. Devil's Backbone stretched before me, an imposing line of rocky outcroppings and dense forest. The campground was deserted, just me, my RV, and a few empty fire pits surrounded by overgrown weeds. Perfect for filming. I set up my equipment, cameras, microphones, a drone for aerial shots. I like to have all the angles covered, even if I expected nothing more than crickets and wind. The legend that brought me here was as ridiculous as they come. A group of hikers claimed that they'd heard chanting and seen glowing symbols near the ridge. The story had racked up millions of views online, and I figured a straightforward debunking would bring in decent traffic. But something about the ridge unsettled me. It wasn't just the isolation. The cliffs had a presence, like they were watching, waiting. After setting up camp, I hiked up to the ridge for some preliminary footage. The trail was steep and narrow, winding through a forest of twisted ancient trees. Their gnarled branches formed a canopy that filtered the sunlight into eerie shifting patterns. About halfway up, I spotted the first symbol. It was carved into the rock, jagged and precise. At first I thought it was graffiti, but it didn't look modern. No spray paint or amateur scribbles. It was intricate, like something you'd see in a textbook on ancient languages. I snapped a photo and moved on, telling myself it was probably just a prank. As I climbed higher, I started to hear faint humming. It wasn't wind or birds. It was rhythmic, almost like chanting. I paused, holding my breath to listen, but it stopped the moment I tried to pinpoint its direction. By the time I reached the ridge, the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the forest below. I launched my drone, hoping to capture the cliffs from above. The drone whirred into the sky, its camera sending back clear, steady footage of the ridge surrounding woods. Then, without warning, the feed cut out. I stared at the screen, confused. The drone was still airborne, but its signal was gone. Moments later, it plummeted out of the sky, crashing somewhere in the trees. Frustrated, I made a note to retrieve it in the morning and headed back to camp as darkness fell. The first few hours of night were uneventful. I sat inside my RV, editing the day's footage and making notes for the next day. Around midnight, I stepped outside to check the cameras I'd placed around the site. That's when I saw the lights. They flickered along the ridge, moving slowly, like lanterns swaying in the wind. I grabbed my binoculars and focused in. What I saw sent a chill down my spine. A figure stood on the edge of the cliff. It was shrouded in shadow, its features indistinct, but it was watching me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling despite my best effort to stay calm. The figure didn't move. Then, slowly, it raised an arm and pointed directly at me. I backed into the RV, slamming the door shut. My hands shook as I locked it, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, or maybe another camper playing a prank. But deep down, I knew better. The next morning, I found scratches on the RV's exterior. They were deep, parallel grooves, like claw marks, running along the side of the vehicle. My stomach churned. I checked my cameras, but the footage was corrupted, static and flickers of distorted images. Determined to get to the bottom of this, I hiked back up the ridge. This time, the symbols were everywhere. They were carved into trees, etched into rocks, even scratched into the dirt. The humming started again, louder and more persistent. I reached the crash site of my drone, but it wasn't there. Instead, I found a backpack. It was torn open, its contents scattered. A water bottle, a map, a trail guide. There was no sign of its owner. As I examined the scene, I felt the air grow colder. A shadow passed over me, and I turned to see the figure from the night before, standing just a few feet away. It wasn't human. Its limbs were too long, its face shrouded in darkness except for its eyes glowing like embers. I ran. Back at camp, I tried to start the RV, but the engine wouldn't turn over. The figure appeared again, standing at the edge of the clearing. This time, it stepped closer. "Why are you here?" a voice hissed, low and guttural. I froze, my mind racing. I thought about Vanessa Davis, the historian I'd spoken to before coming here. She'd warned me about the site's history, that a coven of witches had been executed here centuries ago, accused of summoning spirits to protect their land. "I didn't mean to intrude," I said, my voice shaking. "I'll leave. Just let me go." The figure tilted its head as if considering my words. Then it raised a hand, and the symbols around the campsite began to glow, forming a circle of light that trapped me inside. The voice returned, louder this time. "You seek truth where none is welcome. Leave this place or be consumed by it." Desperate, I searched my gear for anything I could use. I found a small bag of salt, an old trick I'd learned for warding off supposed spirits. I poured it around the RV, forming a crude barrier. The figure screamed, a sound that shook the ground beneath me. It lunged at the barrier, but couldn't cross it. "Stay away," I shouted, holding up the salt bag like a shield. The figure retreated, its glowing eyes fixed on me as it faded into the trees. By dawn, the symbols had disappeared, and the RV's engine started without issue. I didn't look back as I drove away, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. When I reviewed the footage later, most of it was unusable, blurry, distorted, filled with static. But one clip stood out. It showed the figure standing on the ridge, its glowing eyes staring directly into the camera. I uploaded the video to my channel, knowing it would be dismissed as a hoax. That was fine by me. Some truths aren't meant to be explained. My name is Anna Pierce, and I'm 34 years old. This happened last October when I decided to camp alone at Smoke Hollow, a remote site near the Greenbrier River in West Virginia. I thought it would be a quiet, picturesque trip, a chance to photograph the eerie beauty of an old settlement long forgotten by time. Instead, I barely made it out alive. The idea came to me while scrolling through an article about abandoned places. Smoke Hollow was once a bustling logging village in the late 1800s, but in the early 1900s, its population vanished under mysterious circumstances. All that remained were the ruins of a few homes and a cemetery overgrown with moss and wild ivy. Local legends spoke of ghostly wails echoing through the hollow at night, but I figured those were just stories to scare off tourists. I was drawn to the place because it sounded like the perfect subject for my blog, Forgotten Trails. After my divorce, exploring remote and spooky locations became my therapy. Documenting these places filled the empty hours, gave me purpose. I wasn't afraid of being alone, I welcomed it. At least, that's what I told myself. The road to Smoke Hollow was narrow and winding, with ancient trees towering on either side. By the time I arrived at the campground, the late afternoon sun was hidden behind thick grey clouds. The place was deserted, except for a lone park ranger at the check-in station. "First time here?" she asked, smiling. Her name tag read Maya Andrews. "Yeah, heard about it online," I said. Maya nodded. "Beautiful spot, but it can be disorienting. Fog rolls in heavy, and the echoes in the hollow can mess with your sense of direction. Stay on marked paths and you'll be fine." Her words didn't bother me. I'd camped alone before. I smiled, thanked her, and drove to my site near the river. The air was damp and cold, carrying the faint earthy smell of decaying leaves. I parked my RV, set up my gear, and took a short hike to the cemetery before nightfall. The graveyard was small, maybe 20 headstones. Most of them cracked or leaning. One in particular caught my eye. A child's grave marked Lillian Reed, 1898 to 1905. A small lamb was carved into the stone, worn smooth by time. I snapped a few photos, the sky darkening faster than I'd expected, and headed back to camp. That night, the fog came in thick and fast, pressing against the RV windows like a living thing. I was reviewing my photos when I heard it. a faint, high-pitched wail cutting through the silence. It sounded like a child crying. I froze, my heart thudding. It couldn't be an animal. It was too human. I turned off the lights and peered outside. The fog distorted everything, but I saw no movement. I told myself it was just the wind and tried to go back to editing. But the cry came again, this time closer. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, shivering in the cold. "Hello," I called, my voice swallowed by the mist. "Is someone there?" Nothing. Just the river gurgling, faintly in the distance. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I went back inside, I locked the door and pulled the blinds shut. It was a long time before I fell asleep. The next morning, I found wet handprints on my RV windows, small ones, like a child's. My stomach churned. The fog had cleared, leaving the woods damp and muddy, but there were no tracks around the RV, no signs anyone had been there. Shaking off the unease, I decided to head back to the cemetery. It was brighter in the daylight, though the thick canopy still gave the place a shadowy quality. I noticed something I hadn't seen the day before. A journal lying partially buried beneath a toppled tombstone. Curiosity got the better of me. I brushed off the dirt and opened it. The faded handwriting belonged to someone named Eleanor Reed, likely a mother to the child whose grave I'd seen. The entries were ordinary at first, mentioning chores and weather, but they took a darker turn near the end. One passage stuck with me. "Lillian hears them at night, the crying children. I thought she was dreaming, but now I hear them too. We must leave, but the forest won't let us go." My hands trembled as I closed the journal. It was just an old story, I told myself, a grieving mother's imagination. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong with this place. That night, the crying returned, louder and more insistent. I stayed inside, clutching my flashlight. The sound circled the RV as if whoever, or whatever it was, wanted me to follow. I fought the urge to look, but then the generator failed, plunging me into complete darkness. I scrambled for my backup lantern, fumbling with the switch. When it flickered to life, I saw them. Small, wet footprints leading from the door to the far corner of the RV. My breath caught. The crying had stopped, replaced by faint, rapid tapping on the windows. "Go away," I whispered, backing into a corner. The tapping grew louder, frantic, then stopped altogether. The silence was worse. I felt trapped, as though the darkness was closing in, suffocating me. I didn't sleep at all. By morning, I was exhausted and desperate to leave, but when I stepped outside, I saw deep scratches raked across the RV's exterior. The tires were slashed, the rubber shredded like paper. My heart sank. I was stranded. I decided to hike back to the cemetery, hoping to find a clue in Eleanor's journal, or at least distract myself. But the path felt different this time, unfamiliar. The trees seemed to shift around me, their branches reaching like skeletal hands. I stumbled into the clearing, and my blood ran cold. A figure stood by Lillian's grave. At first I thought it was a child, but something about its proportions was wrong. Its arms too long, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. It turned toward me, and I saw its face, hollow eyes and a wide dripping grin. Water pooled around its feet, soaking the earth. I couldn't move. It opened its mouth, emitting a guttural, inhuman wail that echoed through the trees. My legs finally obeyed, and I ran, the sound chasing me all the way back to the RV. That night, the entity attacked. It battered the RV, its cries deafening. The windows rattled, the walls creaked. I remembered the journal's warning. The forest won't let us go. But it wasn't the forest. It was this thing, this embodiment of grief and rage. I thought of what Maya had said about echoes. Desperate, I turned on my phone and played a voice recording I'd taken of her advice. Stay near the marked paths. Her calm, human voice cut through the chaos like a beacon. The entity recoiled, its form flickering. I grabbed the journal, clutching it like a talisman, and shouted, "Lillian, stop! You're free!" The wailing stopped. The air grew still. For a moment I thought it was over, until I heard a soft, wet laugh behind me. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, the RV abandoned behind me. A passing car picked me up, and I barely managed to explain what had happened. When we passed Smoke Hollow, I saw the figure standing in the fog, its hollow eyes following me. I never went back to Smoke Hollow. The photos I took were strange, blurry, distorted, as though the camera couldn't quite capture the truth. But one image haunts me most. A figure standing by Lillian's grave, its face staring straight into the lens, and I've stopped camping alone. Some silences are meant to stay undisturbed. My name is Jesse Morales. I'm 23 years old, and this happened just last fall in the wilderness of Spruce Knob, West Virginia. I was there with my brother Mark, his girlfriend Emily, and his best friend Ryan. We had planned a week-long camping trip, what was supposed to be a much-needed break from the grind of everyday life. Instead, it became a nightmare I can barely talk about even now. It started as a simple idea. Mark, 2008, was always the adventurous one, the kind of guy who thought following a marked trail was too easy. I went along because I needed to document local flora and fauna for my thesis in biology. Emily, 27, tagged along to spend more time with Mark and indulge her love of spooky campfire stories. Then there was Ryan, 26, clumsy at all and lovable, eager to make memories away from his desk job. Together we made an odd group, but we figured we'd have fun. We parked the RV at the Whispering Pines trailhead and set off into the dense, ancient forest. The air smelled of moss and pine, and sunlight dappled the ground through the canopy. Spruce Knob, the highest peak in West Virginia, loomed in the distance. Mark insisted we take an unmarked route he'd found on an old map, and despite my reservations, we followed him deeper into the woods. The first 2 days were relatively uneventful, apart from Ryan's usual mishaps. He forgot a tent pole, forcing us to patch his tent with duct tape. One of our flashlights died inexplicably, even though we'd checked all the batteries beforehand. Small annoyances, but nothing we couldn't handle. It was the second night when things began to feel off. We had set up camp near a clearing, surrounded by spruce trees. The fire crackled, casting shadows that danced on the surrounding trunks. Emily had just finished telling a story about the children of the forest, ghostly figures said to lure hikers to their deaths. Mark groaned and threw a pine cone at her. "Enough of that nonsense," he said. "You're going to scare Ryan." Ryan, to his credit, laughed nervously but didn't respond. That's when I noticed the quiet. The usual nighttime symphony of crickets and distant owls had stopped completely. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. Mark smirked. "I don't hear anything." "That's the point. Peace and quiet, Jess." "No," Emily said, her voice tight. "She's right. It's too quiet." Mark rolled his eyes and poked the fire. "You two are just looking for something to be scared about." I decided to let it go, but a gnawing unease crept into my chest. That night, I woke up to what sounded like footsteps circling the tents. They were deliberate, crunching softly on the forest floor. I held my breath, listening, my heart pounding. "Jessie," a voice whispered. It sounded like Mark. I unzipped my tent slowly, peeking out. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint glow. Just beyond the light, I saw Mark's silhouette standing by the trees. "What are you doing?" I hissed. He didn't respond. "Mark?" The figure turned and walked into the woods. My first thought was that he was sleepwalking. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped out and followed. But when I reached the spot where I'd seen him, he was gone. There were no footsteps in the dirt. When I got back to the tents, Mark was snoring loudly inside his. The next morning, I told the group what I'd seen. Mark laughed it off. "You were dreaming," he said. "Too many ghost stories from Emily." "I wasn't dreaming," I snapped. "I know what I saw." Ryan looked uneasy, but didn't say anything. Emily just stared at the ground. We packed up and continued hiking, but the atmosphere had changed. Mark's confidence began to grate on me. Emily kept glancing over her shoulder, and Ryan's usual jokes dried up. Around midday, we stumbled upon something strange. A set of tracks in the dirt. They looked human but larger, with elongated toes and claw marks at the tips. "What kind of animal leaves tracks like that?" I asked. Mark crouched down, frowning. "Probably a bear with a weird gait." "Bears don't have claws like that," Emily said, her voice trembling. Mark shrugged. "Then maybe Bigfoot." "Relax." But I couldn't relax. The tracks led straight toward our intended campsite. That night was worse. We built a larger fire and sat close to it, as though the flames could ward off whatever was out there. Mark and Emily argued about whether we should turn back. Ryan stayed quiet, staring into the fire like it held answers. Then the laughter started. It was faint at first, like children playing hide and seek in the distance, but it grew louder, circling our camp. "Who's there?" Mark shouted, grabbing his flashlight. The beam flickered and went out. He smacked it against his palm, but it stayed dead. "Jesse." The voice was back, soft and lilting, but this time it wasn't alone. It was joined by Emily's voice, then Ryan's, all of them calling my name. "Stay by the fire," Emily whispered, clutching my arm. "Don't leave the firelight." Mark ignored her and stepped into the darkness. "Mark, no," I shouted. He disappeared into the trees. We waited, calling for him, but he didn't answer. Then we saw him stumble back into the light. His face was pale, his eyes wide. "It's not human," he said, his voice shaking. Before we could ask what he meant, the creature emerged. It stood just beyond the firelight, its form shifting and flickering like a mirage. One moment, it looked like Mark, then Emily, then me. Its face stretched into an unnatural grin, its glowing yellow eyes fixed on us. Emily screamed. Ryan fell backward, scrambling away from the fire. "Salt!" Emily shouted suddenly. "We need salt." I remembered the packets we'd brought for meals. I grabbed them from my bag, ripping them open and tossing the contents around the fire. The creature hissed and recoiled, its form blurring before it vanished into the shadows. We didn't sleep that night. Mark finally admitted we needed to leave, but when we reached the RV the next morning, we found the tires slashed, claw marks gouged into the doors. "It doesn't want us to leave," Emily said, her voice hollow. "Then we walk," I said. "We'll head to the ranger station." The hike was grueling. Every sound in the forest set us on edge, and the feeling of being watched never left. By midday, the creature returned. It didn't attack, but followed us, always just out of sight. Sometimes it looked like Emily, sometimes like Mark, sometimes like something entirely inhuman. When we reached a narrow trail along a cliffside, it attacked. The creature lunged at Mark, who fought it off with a burning stick from our campfire. "Go," he shouted. "Get to the station." "Mark, no," I screamed. But he wouldn't listen. He stood his ground, the flames casting his shadow long against the rocks. We ran. We reached the ranger station at dawn, our legs shaking, lungs burning. The creature didn't follow us into the sunlight, but Mark was gone. Even now I dream of him, standing at the edge of the woods, his eyes glowing yellow. He whispers, "Come back." I never will. My name is Mara Caldwell, and I'm 28 years old. This happened along Paint Creek Scenic Trail in West Virginia, during a trip I'd planned to reconnect with my art and, frankly, myself. It was supposed to be a peaceful escape from the noise of the world, but instead it became something I still can't fully explain. I had just come off a long relationship that ended in the kind of breakup that leaves you questioning everything. Your choices, your direction, your worth. Art was the only thing that felt steady, so I packed up my RV and hit the road. Paint Creek had come up in my research as a serene, lesser-known spot for nature lovers. I thought it'd be the perfect place to spend a few days sketching and painting in solitude. When I arrived, the place was exactly as described. Quiet, secluded, and hauntingly beautiful. The creek meandered through dense woods, its surface catching the sunlight like shards of glass. The leaves were just starting to turn, and the air carried a faint chill that hinted at the coming fall. I parked my RV near an old wooden bridge that crossed the creek. The bridge looked like it belonged in a ghost story, its weathered boards sagging slightly, but I couldn't resist its charm. I set up camp and spent the first day wandering the trails and sketching the landscape. The stillness was almost too perfect, but I chalked it up to being unused to this level of isolation. That night, I sat by the creek, working on a watercolor of the bridge as the sun dipped below the horizon. The forest around me grew darker, and the silence became oppressive. There were no birds, no insects, just the sound of the water trickling over rocks. I tried to focus on my painting, but a strange unease crept over me. It was like the air had shifted, growing heavier, colder, and then I heard it, a faint humming. It was soft at first, almost melodic, but it didn't seem to have a source. It wasn't coming from the creek or the woods. It was just there. I froze, my brush hovering over the paper. The sound grew louder, more distinct, and I realized it was a woman's voice, humming a tune I didn't recognize. "Hello," I called out, my voice breaking the stillness. The humming stopped abruptly, as if I'd startled it. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. I told myself it must have been the wind or some trick of acoustics, packed up my supplies, and hurried back to the RV. The next morning, I woke to find my art supplies scattered across the ground outside the RV. My brushes were snapped in half, my paint spilled and smeared across the dirt. My first thought was that an animal had gotten into them, but there were no paw prints, no signs of disturbance other than the destruction itself. It didn't make sense. I spent the day trying to paint, but something felt off. The colors didn't look right, the lines felt shaky. Frustrated, I decided to take a break and explore more of the area. The old bridge drew me in again, its weathered planks creaking under my boots as I crossed it. The creek below was impossibly still, its surface like a mirror reflecting the gnarled trees overhead. On the far side of the bridge, I noticed something etched into one of the trees, a name and a date carved deep into the bark. Margaret, 1893. The letters were uneven, as if done in haste, but what caught my attention was the feeling that swept over me as I touched the carving, a sudden, overwhelming sadness that didn't feel like my own. That night, the humming returned. I was inside the RV, trying to sketch, when I heard it again, drifting through the stillness. It was louder this time, unmistakable. The sound seemed to seep through the walls, wrapping around me like a cold embrace. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, my heart pounding. The air was icy, much colder than it had been earlier, and the forest was eerily quiet. The humming led me to the bridge, where the fog had thickened, shrouding the creek in an otherworldly glow. And then I saw her. She stood at the edge of the creek, her back to me. She wore a long dress, the kind you'd see in old photographs, and her hair cascaded down her back in dark waves. She was humming that same mournful tune, the sound weaving through the air like a spell. "Hello?" I called out, voice trembling. She stopped humming but didn't turn around. I took a hesitant step closer, and as I did, she began to dissolve, her form breaking apart like mist until there was nothing left but the fog. I stood there, frozen, unsure if what I'd seen was real or some trick of the light in my overactive imagination. The next day, I decided to drive into town to clear my head. At a small gas station, I struck up a conversation with the attendant, an older man who seemed to know the area well. "You're camping by the bridge, aren't you?" he asked when I mentioned Paint Creek. "Yeah, why?" He hesitated, then said, "People say it's haunted. They call her the Lady of Paint Creek. Story goes, she was abandoned by her husband during a harsh winter. He promised to come back for her, but he never did. She waited by that bridge until she froze to death. Now she haunts the creek, looking for people to join her." I laughed nervously, but his expression remained serious. "I'd avoid that bridge if I were you," he added, "especially at night." That evening, I couldn't stay away. Something about the Lady of Paint Creek drew me in, like a moth to a flame. I set up my easel near the bridge, determined to capture her essence in my painting. As the hours passed and the sun dipped below the horizon, the fog rolled in again, and the humming returned. This time, it was louder, more insistent. The air around me grew colder, and when I looked up, there she was, standing in the middle of the bridge. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her hollow eyes bore into mine. She didn't move, but the humming turned into words, a whisper that sent chills down my spine. "Stay with me." I backed away, but my foot slipped on the wet grass, and I fell. When I looked up, she was gone, but the feeling of her presence lingered, heavy and suffocating. I grabbed my supplies and ran back to the RV, locking the door behind me. The night I dreamed of her. In the dream, I was standing on the bridge, staring down at the icy water. She appeared beside me, her hand cold as she touched my arm. "He left me," she whispered, her voice filled with sorrow. "They all leave." When I woke, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still there, just beyond the edges of my vision. I knew I had to do something to end this, to break her hold on me. On my final night at Paint Creek, I returned to the bridge with my sketchbook and paints. The fog was thicker than ever, and the cold seeped into my bones. I set up my supplies and began to paint, my hands trembling as I worked. I painted her story, the bridge, the creek, her lonely figure waiting in the snow. As I finished, the humming surrounded me, and she appeared again, this time closer. Her hollow eyes were filled with tears, and she reached out a hand toward the painting. I stepped back, unsure of what to do. "You're remembered now," I said, my voice breaking. "You're not forgotten." She stared at the painting for what felt like an eternity, then dissolved into the mist, her presence lifting like a weight from my chest. The forest grew quiet again, and for the first time, I felt a sense of peace. I left Paint Creek the next morning, the painting tucked safely in the RV. It's one of my best works, but I've never been able to sell it. Something about it feels sacred, like it belongs to her. Even now, I hear her humming in my dreams, but it's softer now, almost peaceful, as if she's finally found rest, and maybe, in a way, so have I. My name is Ethan Grady, and I'm 35 years old. This happened in the Dolly Sods Wilderness, West Virginia, during what was supposed to be a peaceful week of camping. I had no idea how quickly my retreat into solitude would turn into something out of a nightmare, one I'm still not entirely sure I escaped. I've been camping for years, usually alone. It started as a way to clear my head after I left firefighting, but it quickly became my way of life. Out here, there's no noise, no reminders of my failures, no people to disappoint. Just me, my RV, and the wild. I'd read about Dolly Sods online, rugged trails, beautiful overlooks, the kind of place where you could truly feel off the grid. That's exactly what I wanted. I parked my RV near a trailhead that wasn't even marked on the maps. The road had been rough, full of potholes and overgrown branches, but I liked that. The harder it was to get there, the fewer people I'd run into. The first couple of days were uneventful. I hiked, gathered firewood, and took in the scenery. The wilderness was hauntingly beautiful. Mist rolling through the trees in the mornings, the sunlight casting golden patterns on the forest floor. But on the third day, things started to shift. I was out for a hike when I heard it for the first time. A faint, high-pitched whistle. At first, I thought it might be a bird, but it wasn't rhythmic, and it didn't seem to come from any particular direction. It would start, then stop abruptly, as if someone or something was toying with me. I tried to ignore it, but the sound followed me all the way back to camp. That night, as I sat by the fire, I heard it again. A long, mournful whistle that seemed closer this time. I shined my flashlight into the woods, but there was nothing there. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I told myself it was just the wind. The next morning, I decided to venture deeper into the forest. I marked my path carefully. Broken branches, small piles of stones so I wouldn't get lost. The weather was strange, with the sky shifting between sunny and overcast, but that wasn't unusual in the mountains. About an hour in, I came across something odd. Carvings on a tree. They were fresh, not the kind of marks that years of growth would stretch and fade. There were symbols, circles, arrows, and stick figures with hollow, featureless faces. I touched the bark, half expecting it to feel hot or cold, but it was just wood. Still, it sent a shiver through me. I kept going, but the forest seemed wrong. The trees were denser here, their branches twisting unnaturally. The ground was covered in moss that felt too soft, like stepping on sponge. The whistle came again, faint but persistent. It almost sounded like it was calling my name. By the time I turned back, I realized the trail markings I'd made were gone. The broken branches were whole, the piles of stones scattered. I took out my compass, but the needle spun aimlessly. My GPS wouldn't connect either. Panic started to creep in. I'd never been lost like this before. I forced myself to stay calm and retrace my steps as best as I could. After what felt like hours, I stumbled into a clearing, and that's when I saw it. The hollow tree. It was massive, its bark blackened and split in places, as if it had been struck by lightning. A large opening at its base gaped like a mouth. Around it were more carvings, some etched into the stones that surrounded the tree-like sentinels. The air here was different. Heavy, charged, as if a storm was about to break. I heard the whistle again, but this time it was followed by a voice. "Ethan?" I froze. It was a voice I hadn't heard in years, but I recognized it instantly. Charlie. My partner from my firefighting days. The man I'd failed to save. "No," I whispered, backing away. This wasn't possible. Charlie was dead. I saw him die. But the voice came again, softer this time, tinged with pain. "Ethan, why did you leave me?" My head swam. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The whistle grew louder, and the shadows around the tree seemed to deepen, pooling like ink. Something stepped out from the hollow, tall, thin, with impossibly long limbs, and a face that wasn't a face. Its eyes were hollow pits, its mouth an empty void. It didn't move toward me. It didn't need to. Its presence was suffocating. My chest tightened, and I felt like I was drowning. The voice continued, but now it wasn't just Charlie. It was my father, my sister, people I hadn't thought about in years, all of them accusing me, asking why I hadn't done more. The figure raised a hand, and the shadows around it shifted, forming shapes. People, but wrong. Their faces were blank, their bodies twisted. They reached for me, their hollow eyes accusing. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in gasps. "Stay away!" I shouted, though my voice sounded small and weak. The entity didn't stop. It stepped closer, and with each step, the memories it projected became sharper, more vivid. The fire that killed Charlie, my father's disappointed face when I quit firefighting, the friends I'd pushed away. It was all too much. I don't know how I made it back to the RV. My legs moved on autopilot, carrying me through the forest as the whistle followed, growing fainter but never disappearing. When I finally reached the clearing where the RV was parked, I collapsed against the side, gasping for air. I locked the doors and sat in the driver's seat, my hands shaking. I tried to start the engine, but it wouldn't turn over. I checked my watch, but the hands weren't moving. Everything felt wrong, as if time itself had stopped. That night, the entity came again. I didn't see it, but I felt its presence, heavy and cold, pressing against the walls of the RV. Shadows moved outside the windows, and the whistle pierced the silence. I tried to block it out, covering my ears, but the voices came anyway, whispering inside my head, "You can't run, Ethan." The next day, I found a journal tucked into the bushes near the RV. It was old, the pages yellowed and brittle, but the writing was clear. It belonged to someone named Daniel, a camper who had been here years ago. His entries started normal enough, descriptions of hikes, wildlife, the beauty of the wilderness. But as I flipped through, the tone changed. He wrote about the whistle, the carvings, the hollow tree. The last entry sent a chill down my spine. It wants what you regret most. It feeds on it. If you don't give it what it wants, it will take everything. I knew what I had to do. I didn't have a plan, just a desperate idea. I gathered a metal pole, some rope, and a fire starter from the RV. The storm clouds were rolling in, and I hoped I could use the lightning to destroy whatever was tied to the tree. When I returned to the hollow tree, the entity was waiting for me. Its hollow eyes bore into mine, and the shadows writhed around it like living things. The whistle was deafening now, and the voices screamed in my head. I tied the metal pole to one of the stones near the tree, angling it toward the sky. My hands shook as I worked, but I couldn't stop. The entity didn't try to stop me, it just stood there, watching, as if amused by my efforts. When the storm broke, I stood in the clearing holding my breath. Lightning streaked across the sky, and I prayed it would hit the pole. For a moment, nothing happened, and I thought I'd failed. Then the bolt came. It struck the pole, and the energy surged into the ground, splitting the hollow tree with a deafening crack. The entity let out a scream, high-pitched, inhuman, filled with rage and pain. The shadows dissolved, and the whistle stopped. I stumbled back to the RV, my body trembling, my mind reeling. The storm passed as quickly as it had come, and for the first time in days the forest felt normal, quiet, still. The engine started on the first try, and I drove away without looking back. I don't know if I destroyed the Hollow Watcher, or if I just escaped its grasp, but I do know one thing. I'll never go back to Dolly Sods, and I'll never camp alone again. Some places aren't meant to be explored, no matter how beautiful they seem. My name is Clara Winters, and I'm 29 years old. This happened in the remote woods near Spruce Knob Lake, West Virginia. I thought it would be a fun little adventure, a chance to reconnect with my old friend Mike Carson, who's 31, while writing a travel piece about hidden gems in the Appalachian wilderness. I didn't expect we'd encounter something that would haunt us forever. The trip started out as a mix of nostalgia and practicality. Mike and I used to camp together years ago, back when we both lived in the same town. Life had pulled us in different directions, but I wanted to rekindle that bond and maybe get some good material for my article. When I pitched the idea of camping by the lake, Mike hesitated. "Are you sure about that spot, Clara? I've heard weird things about that area," he'd said. "Come on, Mike, it'll be fine," I replied, brushing off his concerns. "What's the worst that could happen? Bears? We'll keep the food locked up." Reluctantly, he agreed, and the following weekend, we loaded up my old RV, a temperamental beast prone to sputtering at the worst times, and headed into the mountains. The drive to Spruce Knob was stunning, with the rolling hills and dense forests that seemed to swallow us whole as we ascended the winding roads. We reached the lake just before sunset. The water shimmered in the golden light, and the surrounding trees stood tall and silent, as if guarding the place. A few fishermen waved at us from a distance, but as we drove deeper into the woods to find a secluded campsite, we left the last signs of civilization behind. We parked the RV in a small clearing near the tree line. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. There were no sounds of birds, no rustling leaves, just a heavy, oppressive silence. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just the quiet of nature, and we got to work setting up camp. Mike built a fire while I fiddled with the propane stove, which, true to form, refused to work. "Guess we're doing everything the old-fashioned way," I said with a laugh, though I could tell Mike was annoyed. "Should have brought my own gear," he muttered. "This thing's a death trap." That night, As we sat around the fire, we shared stories and beers, laughing about our old adventures. It felt good, like old times, but as the fire burned low, I started to notice odd things. First, there were the noises. At first it was faint, like children's laughter carried on the wind. I froze, straining to hear, but when I asked Mike if he heard it, he shook his head. "You're imagining things," he said, tossing another log on the fire, but I wasn't. The laughter grew louder, mingling with what sounded like whispers, though I couldn't make out the words. I glanced over my shoulder at the dark woods, but there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. I told myself it was the wind, or maybe a trick of the mind after a long day. Then came the smell. It was faint at first, a sickly sweet odor that made my stomach churn. It reminded me of roadkill left out in the sun for too long. Mike smelled it too, and he looked uneasy for the first time. "Maybe a dead deer nearby," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. We went to bed soon after that, locking ourselves inside the RV. I didn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like something was watching us. The next morning, we decided to explore the woods around the lake. I had my camera slung over my shoulder, ready to capture the natural beauty of the area. But what we found was anything but beautiful. It started with the animal carcasses. We stumbled upon a trail of them. Raccoons, rabbits, even a deer, all mutilated in ways that didn't seem natural. Their bodies were arranged in a line, as if they were pointing toward something. My stomach turned, but I couldn't look away. "What the hell did this?" Mike whispered, his face pale. "I don't know," I said. "A bear? Wolves?" But deep down, I didn't believe that. The wounds were too precise, too deliberate. The trail led us to a clearing where an ancient tree stood, its gnarled branches twisting skyward like skeletal fingers. The bark was blackened, as if it had been burned, but the tree was very much alive. It exuded a strange energy, making the air around it feel thick and heavy. I felt a chill run down my spine, just looking at it. "This must be the Devil's Tree," Mike said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The what?" "I read about it online," he admitted. "Locals say it's cursed. Some witch was hanged here in the 1800s, and her spirit supposedly haunts it." "Great, you tell me this now," I said, half joking. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we shouldn't be there. We didn't stay long. The whispers started again, louder this time, and they seemed to be coming from the tree itself. I snapped a few photos before we retreated back to the RV. Things escalated quickly after that. That night, the whispers returned, but they weren't outside anymore. They were inside the RV. I woke up to the sound of my father's voice calling my name, even though he'd been dead for years. "Clara, come here," the voice beckoned. It sounded so real, so warm, that for a moment I believed it. But when I got up and looked outside, there was nothing there. Just the dark woods and the faint outline of the Devil's Tree in the distance. Mike wasn't doing any better. He claimed he saw me standing outside the RV, staring at him through the window. But I hadn't left my bed. The next morning, we found claw marks on the RV's walls, deep, jagged scratches that hadn't been there before. Mike wanted to leave, but the engine wouldn't start. No matter what we tried, the RV refused to move. "We're stuck here," he said grimly. "We need to figure out how to end this." We decided to confront the tree, though neither of us really knew what we were doing. Armed with a can of lighter fluid and a box of matches, we trekked back to the clearing. The whispers grew louder as we approached, morphing into a cacophony of voices. Some pleading, some angry, some crying. My hands trembled as I doused the base of the tree with fluid. "Are you sure about this?" Mike asked, his voice shaking. "No," I admitted. "But we don't have a choice." I struck the match and tossed it onto the tree. The flames roared to life, but almost immediately they were snuffed out as if an unseen hand had smothered them. The air grew cold, and the shadows around us began to move. That's when we saw it, a figure emerging from the tree itself. It was tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes and a mouth that stretched too wide. It didn't move toward us, but its presence was enough to paralyze me with fear. "You trespassed," it said, though its lips didn't move. "Blood for blood." Mike grabbed my arm, snapping me out of my trance. "Run," he shouted, and we bolted back toward the RV. The entity didn't follow us, but its voice echoed in our heads, growing fainter the farther we ran. Back at the RV, we found a knife and debated what to do. The entity wanted blood. Did it mean a sacrifice? I wasn't about to offer myself or Mike, but we had to do something. In a desperate act, I cut my palm and let the blood drip onto the ground outside the RV. I didn't know if it would work, but the whispers stopped almost immediately. The air grew warmer, and the oppressive feeling lifted. A moment later, the RV roared to life on its own. Without wasting another second, we got in and drove away, leaving the Devil's Tree behind. I never wrote about that trip. Not the truth, anyway. The article I published was a generic piece about camping tips and scenic views. But the memory of what happened near Spruce Knob Lake still lingers. I don't know if the entity is gone for good, or if it's waiting for the next trespasser to stumble upon its cursed domain. All I know is, I'm never going back. My name is Victor Ruiz, and I was 41 years old when this happened in the summer of 2022. After retiring from the military, I spent most of my days traveling the country in my RV, searching for something I couldn't quite name. Peace, maybe, or just a sense of purpose. I'd spent decades in combat zones, surrounded by noise and chaos, and I thought the wilderness might silence the ghosts in my head. That's what brought me to the Laurel Fork Wilderness in West Virginia. I'd heard about the area from a fellow camper, a secluded stretch of forest, untouched and serene. Perfect for someone like me who preferred solitude. I didn't know then about the stories surrounding Devil's Hollow, or the witch that locals claimed cursed the land. If I had, I might have gone somewhere else. Or maybe not. The first day was uneventful. The road to my chosen campsite was narrow and bumpy, the kind of terrain that tested your patience and your vehicle. My RV wasn't new, but it had served me well over the years. Still, it groaned and sputtered as I navigated the steep incline toward the hollow. About a mile from my intended spot, the engine stalled. I cursed under my breath, turning the key repeatedly, but all I got was the tired whine of a machine that had had enough. I grabbed my tools, hoping it was something simple, but as the hours dragged on, it became clear that I wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. "Well," I muttered, wiping grease from my hands, "guess this is home for now." I set up camp just off the road, close enough to the hollow to feel its presence, but far enough to keep my distance. The air was cooler here, the shadows deeper. I told myself it was just the terrain, the dense canopy blocking out the sun. But there was something else too, a heaviness I couldn't explain. The first night, I slept poorly. The forest was too quiet, the kind of silence that amplifies every creak and rustle. I'd spent enough time in the wild to know the sounds of nocturnal animals, but this was different. There were no owls, no crickets, nothing but the occasional groan of the wind through the trees. At some point, I thought I heard something outside the RV, a faint scratching, like claws against metal. I froze, listening, but it stopped as quickly as it had started. When I finally worked up the nerve to look, flashlight in hand, there was nothing there, just the endless expanse of trees. I told myself it was the wind and went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, I found the dead birds. They were arranged in a perfect circle about 10 feet from my RV. Their feathers ruffled but otherwise untouched. There were no signs of an attack, no blood, just 7 small bodies, their lifeless eyes staring up at the canopy. My stomach churned as I stood over them, trying to make sense of it. Predators don't do this. Even kids pulling pranks wouldn't bother hiking this far out. I buried them, more out of respect than anything else, and spent the rest of the day exploring the area. The forest was dense, the trails barely more than animal paths winding through the underbrush. About a mile in, I found the first symbol. It was carved into the bark of a tree, a jagged spiral surrounded by smaller runes I didn't recognize. The cuts were fresh, the edges of the bark still raw. My first thought was kids again, but the precision of the carvings made me second guess. This wasn't random graffiti, it meant something, though I didn't know what. That night, the storm rolled in. The wind howled through the hollow, rain hammering against the roof of the RV. I huddled inside, reading by flashlight, the sound of the storm oddly comforting. It drowned out the silence, the oppressive weight of the forest. But then the whispers started. At first I thought it was the wind, the way it curled up. My voice was hoarse, and I thought to myself, I stood around the trees, carrying the echoes of distant sounds. But as I listened, the whispers grew more distinct, more deliberate. They weren't words exactly, but they carried intent, a low murmuring chant that made my skin crawl. I tried to ignore it, burying my head in my book, but the sound burrowed into my mind. It felt like it was coming from inside the RV, pressing against my skull. And then I saw her. She stood just outside the window, barely visible through the rain-streaked glass. A cloaked figure, her face hidden in the shadows of her hood. She didn't move, didn't make a sound, but her presence was suffocating. I grabbed my flashlight and swung open the door, but by the time I stepped outside, she was gone. The next day, I found the grave marker. It was tucked deep within the hollow, a small stone slab half buried in moss and dirt. The name was barely legible, worn down by centuries of weather: Margaret Ellis. Beside it, I found a charred leather diary, its pages brittle and stained. I flipped through it carefully, piecing together fragments of Margaret's story. She wasn't a witch, not in the way the legends claimed. She'd been a healer, accused by her neighbors when a plague swept through the settlement. They blamed her for the deaths, dragging her into the hollow and burning her at the stake. Her final entry was a curse, scrawled in trembling handwriting. To those who condemned me, I curse this hollow with my dying breath. May your bloodline suffer as I have suffered, and may no soul find peace in this cursed place. That night was the worst. The storm returned, fiercer than before, and the whispers gave way to screams. They were everywhere, echoing off the walls of the RV, filling every corner with their anguish. The cloaked figure appeared again, closer this time. She stood in the middle of the clearing, her hood pulled back to reveal a face that was both beautiful and grotesque, her eyes burning like embers. "Why did you come here?" she asked, her voice a low growl that vibrated in my chest. My throat tightened, the words catching like barbed wire. "I didn't know." Her expression twisted into a sneer. "They never know." She raised a hand, and the world tilted. I fell to my knees, my vision blurring as memories flooded my mind, moments I'd tried so hard to forget. The sounds of gunfire, the screams of my comrades, the smell of blood and burning sand. "Stop!" I shouted, clutching my head. "Please, stop!" The screams faded, replaced by her laughter. "You carry death with you, soldier," she said. "Why should I spare you?" Desperate, I fumbled for my dog tags, ripping them from my neck. "I'm sorry," I choked out, holding them up. "For whatever they did to you, I'm sorry." Her laughter stopped. She stared at the tags, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she lowered her hand. The storm ceased, the whispers faded, and she was gone. The next morning, I left the hollow. My RV started without a hitch, as if the past few days had been nothing more than a bad dream. But as I drove down the winding road, I couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret Ellis was watching me, her presence lingering in the shadows. I don't know if I appeased her, or if she simply let me go. But I do know one thing: there are places in this world that remember the horrors done to them, places that hold grudges. And Devil's Hollow is one of them. My name is Marlene Abbott, and I was 35 years old when this happened in October 2021. I'm a freelance writer, mostly covering travel and folklore. I've spent years chasing stories, driving my RV from one place to the next, always chasing inspiration, or maybe just running away. Back then, I thought of myself as independent, untethered, invincible. But Spruce Knob changed that. It was supposed to be a quick trip. I'd heard whispers about a place in West Virginia where strange things happened, laughing voices in the woods, small footprints appearing where no child had walked in decades. The locals called it the Lost Children of Spruce Knob. The legend was vague, tied to an old settlement that had long since disappeared, a winter storm, children wandering too far, and a tragedy that no one liked to talk about. It was exactly the kind of story my editor loved. I arrived at the campsite just before sunset. The drive had been rough, the winding roads climbing higher and higher into the dense forest. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that settles in your bones. My RV sputtered a bit as I parked, but I didn't think much of it. I was used to minor mechanical issues. The campsite was deserted, just how I liked it. Solitude made it easier to ride. I spent the first hour setting up, unpacking my laptop and notes, snapping a few photos of the eerie, misty forest for my article. By the time I lit a small fire, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the world bathed in a dusky blue. That's when I heard it. At first it was faint, like the distant hum of the wind, but as I sat by the fire sipping lukewarm coffee, the sound grew clearer. Laughter, high-pitched and playful, like children chasing each other in a game of tag. I froze, the mug halfway to my lips. The nearest town was miles away. Who would bring children all the way out here at night? Hello? I called, my voice shaky. The laughter stopped. I stood, shining my flashlight toward the tree line. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the skeletal branches swaying in the wind. I told myself it was my imagination, the product of too many ghost stories and too much caffeine. But as I turned back to the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning I found footprints. They were small, barefoot, pressed into the dirt just outside my RV. A trail of them circled the fire pit and wandered toward the trees. My stomach churned. I crouched, running my fingers over one of the prints. It couldn't have been there long. The edges were still sharp, undisturbed by wind or dew. I took a photo, the click of my camera loud in the still morning air. "This is ridiculous," I muttered. Straightening. But even as I brushed it off, my pulse quickened. I spent the day exploring, hiking through the dense woods with my notebook in hand. The forest felt oppressive, the kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every twig snapping underfoot. I found an abandoned cabin about a mile from the campsite, its roof caved in, walls covered in moss and lichen. Inside, I discovered old yellowed pages scattered across the floor. The handwriting was faint, but I could make out enough to piece together the story. The cabin had belonged to a family who'd settled here in the 1800s. They had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. During a brutal winter, the father sent the children out to gather firewood. A storm rolled in suddenly, and they never came back. Their bodies were never found, and the parents were said to have gone mad with grief. I shivered, hugging my coat tighter. The pages felt heavy in my hands, the words pressing into my mind like a weight. That night, the laughter returned. It started faintly, just like before, but this time it was accompanied by something else, a tapping sound. At first I thought it was the wind rattling the RV, but then it grew more deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. Like small fingers drumming against the window, I didn't want to look. Every instinct screamed at me to stay hidden under my blanket, to pretend I didn't hear it, but curiosity is a terrible thing. Slowly, I slid out of bed and crept toward the window. The fog outside was thick, swirling like smoke, but through it I saw a shape, a small figure standing just beyond the fire pit. My breath caught. It was a little girl, no older than 7, with long hair tangled around her face. Her dress was ragged, her bare feet pale against the damp earth. She stood perfectly still, her head tilted, as if waiting for me to step outside. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding. "Nope," I whispered. "No way." The tapping stopped. When I finally worked up the courage to look again, she was gone. The next morning, my RV wouldn't start. I turned the key over and over, but the engine just coughed and sputtered. The battery was fine, the fuel gauge full. I had no explanation. "Great," I muttered, slamming the steering wheel. Just great. There was no cell service, no way to call for help. I was stranded. Determined to distract myself, I decided to hike back to the cabin. Maybe I could find more of the journal pages, something to help me understand what was happening. But as I neared the cabin, the forest seemed darker, the air colder. I found the doll on the trail. It was old, its fabric faded and torn, one button eye missing. It hadn't been there the day before. I hesitated, staring at it. Something moved in the corner of my vision, a flicker of motion among the trees. I turned sharply, but there was nothing there. "Marlene," a voice whispered. I spun around, my pulse racing. "Marlene." It was a child's voice, soft and pleading, coming from deeper in the woods. "Nope," I said again, backing away. But as I turned to leave, the voice grew louder, more insistent. "Help us." I ran. By the time I reached the RV, I was shaking. My rational mind was unraveling. Every explanation I'd clung to slipping through my fingers. I locked the door and curled up on the bed, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline. The children didn't wait for nightfall this time. The laughter echoed through the forest, closer and louder than ever. Shadows darted outside the windows, too quick to be seen clearly. The tapping returned, relentless and mocking. And then they came inside. I didn't see them enter, but suddenly they were there. 3 small figures standing at the foot of my bed. Their faces were pale and frostbitten, their eyes wide and hollow. "Why didn't they come back for us?" the little girl asked, her voice like a cold wind. I don't know," I stammered. "They promised," the voice said. "They promised they'd come back." My breath hitched as tears filled my eyes. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." They stared at me, their expressions unreadable. And then they were gone. The next morning, I knew what I had to do. I gathered firewood and built a small pyre near the cabin. I placed the doll on top, along with an offering of food and a scarf I found in my RV. Lighting the fire, I whispered a prayer. Not to any god I knew, but to the lost children. "I hope this helps," I said, my voice cracking. "I hope it guides you home." The air grew still, the forest holding its breath. For a moment, I thought I'd failed. But then the fire flared, a brilliant golden light that chased away the shadows. The fog lifted. The forest seemed quieter, calmer. When I returned to the RV, It started on the first try. I never wrote the article. Some stories aren't meant to be told, and some wounds aren't meant to be reopened. But I left Spruce Knob with a strange sense of peace, as if the children had finally found their way. And maybe, in some small way, so had I. My name is Jake Sullivan, and I was 28 years old when this happened in the fall of 2022. I've always been a skeptic. Science, facts, logic. That's my religion. Ghost stories and urban legends, they're just entertainment. A way for people to make sense of what they can't explain. At least that's what I thought before that weekend in Dolly Sods. It was supposed to be a routine backpacking trip. Just me, my best friend Chris, and his girlfriend Lila. Chris and I had been hiking together since college, and while Lila was newer to the group, she was no rookie. She'd done some Appalachian Trail sections and could hold her own. The plan was simple. 3 days in Dolly Sods wilderness. A rugged stretch of land in West Virginia known for its otherworldly landscapes. Chris had picked it after reading about its haunted reputation. I rolled my eyes, but agreed. It would be a good story for him to tell over beers. We set off on a Friday morning, our packs heavy with gear, water, and food. The first few hours were uneventful. The air was crisp, the trail well marked, and the scenery stunning. Lila walked a few paces ahead, her long braids swinging as she stopped every so often to snap photos. Chris was his usual self, cracking jokes about the ghosts watching us. "You think Casper's gonna show up and roast marshmallows with us?" he said, nudging my arm. "More like Bigfoot," I replied. "Hope you packed extra jerky." By midday, we'd veered off the main trail onto a less traveled path. That was our first mistake. Chris insisted it would be more authentic, a word that always meant trouble. Lila looked uneasy but didn't argue. I should have turned us back then, but my pride wouldn't let me admit we were heading into uncharted territory. That night, we set up camp in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. The sky was clear, and the stars were so bright you could almost forget civilization existed. After dinner, we sat around the fire, trading stories and laughing. Lila was quieter than usual, her eyes darting to the trees every so often. "You okay?" I asked. "Yeah," she said quickly, forcing a smile. I don't know. This place feels weird, like it's watching us." Chris laughed. "The sods have eyes, huh? Don't worry, babe. I'll protect you from the big bad forest." I rolled my eyes. "Let's call it a night. Long day tomorrow." We crawled into our tents, and I was out within minutes. But sometime in the middle of the night, I woke to the sound of whispers. Faint, like they were carried on the wind. I lay still, straining to hear. It wasn't words exactly, more like a murmur, but it felt deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent. "Chris?" I called softly. No answer. I swept the beam across the clearing. Nothing. Just the flicker of dying embers in the fire pit in the sway of the trees. I chalked it up to my imagination and went back to sleep. The next morning, Lila looked pale, dark circles under her eyes. "You okay?" Chris asked, pouring her a cup of instant coffee. She hesitated. I heard something last night. Whispering. Chris grinned. See, I told you, ghosts. They probably wanted some s'mores. I expected her to laugh, but she didn't. Instead, she shot me a look like she was silently asking if I'd heard it too. I nodded, and her face tightened. We packed up and moved on, but the mood was different. Lila kept glancing over her shoulder, and even Chris was quieter than usual. By midday, our GPS started acting up, refusing to lock onto satellites. I pulled out the paper map, but it was no use. The terrain didn't match anything on it. We were lost. Let's just backtrack, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Chris shook his head. We're fine. The trail's got to be around here somewhere. We pressed on, but the more we walked, the stranger things became. The trees seemed closer together, their branches intertwining like skeletal hands. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating. And then there were the tracks, hoof prints in the mud, but not from any deer. They were too deep, too large. Some even looked like they ended in clawed toes. I tried to dismiss them, but Lila froze when she saw them. This isn't normal, she whispered. Chris shrugged. Probably just an old cow or something. In the middle of Dolly Sods, she snapped. We're miles from any farms. We kept walking, but the tension was palpable. That evening, we stumbled upon a clearing with a circle of stones in the center. At first, I thought it was a fire pit, but as we got closer, I saw the bones. Animal bones, bleached white and arranged in strange patterns. Chris let out a nervous laugh. Well, that's not creepy at all. We need to leave, Lila said firmly, now. It's just some weirdo's idea of art, Chris said, but even he looked uneasy. Let's camp somewhere else. We moved another mile before setting up camp, but none of us slept well. The whispers came again, louder this time, and closer. They weren't just sounds, they were voices calling our names. Around 3 a.m., I heard what sounded like Chris outside my tent, his voice low and urgent. Jake, come here. I unzipped the tent, but he wasn't there. Just darkness and the rustle of leaves. When I checked his tent, he was sound asleep. The next morning, Lila refused to go any further. I'm done, she said, her voice shaking. We need to go back. We don't even know which way back is, Chris argued. Then we stay put and wait for help. Out here, with no signal, no way. I sided with Chris, though I regretted it almost immediately. By midday, we were hopelessly lost, the forest closing in around us. That's when it took Chris. He'd wandered off to relieve himself while Lila and I rested by a fallen log. 5 minutes passed, then 10. When he didn't come back, we called his name. No answer. I grabbed my flashlight and started searching, Lila close behind. We found him an hour later, or what was left of him. He was hanging from a tree, his face twisted in terror, his body mangled like something had torn him apart. Lila screamed, and I barely kept from throwing up. We didn't stay to examine him. We ran. By nightfall, we were utterly lost. The whispers followed us, louder now, more insistent. And then we saw it, a figure at the edge of our firelight. It looked human, but its limbs were too long, its head tilted unnaturally. Its glowing eyes burned into me, and when it spoke, it used my voice. "Jake, come here." Lila started chanting under her breath, something about sage and protection. The figure hissed and retreated, but I knew it wasn't gone. We didn't sleep that night, and by dawn, we were stumbling through the forest, exhausted and terrified. When we finally reached the edge of the woods, I almost cried. We collapsed near a ranger station, and when they found us, we tried to explain, but no one believed us. They chalked it up to exposure and trauma. Chris's body was never found. I haven't been back to the woods since. I don't plan to. Whatever's out there, it's not meant to be understood, and I know one thing for sure. Some legends are real. My name is Sarah Holt, and I was 29 when this happened. It was early May 2022, and I'd just finished a grueling 6-month contract as a travel nurse in Baltimore. The job had been brutal. Long shifts, heartbreaking cases, and one patient I couldn't save, no matter how hard I tried. His face still lingered in my mind, and I needed space to breathe. That's why I bought the RV. I had no plan except to drive, park somewhere beautiful, and let the quiet heal me. That's how I ended up at Seneca Creek, near Smokehole Canyon, West Virginia. The locals called it Devil's Gorge, but I didn't care about the name. I cared about the view. The pull-off was perfect, isolated and perched right on the edge of the gorge. The air was cool and smelled of pine, and the canyon spread out below me in jagged cliffs and swirling mist. I parked my RV, stepped out, and just stood there, letting the silence soak into my bones. I felt a glimmer of peace for the first time in months. My plan was simple. Hike, take some photos, and not think about anything for a while. I grabbed my camera and followed a faint trail along the edge of the gorge. The path wound through dense trees, their branches forming a canopy so thick it felt like dusk, even though it was mid-afternoon. That's when I found it. The stone altar was tucked into a hollow, half hidden by vines and moss. It looked ancient, weathered, and wrong. There was something unnatural about its placement, like it didn't belong here. Carved into its surface was the word Malum, Latin, evil. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature, but I couldn't stop myself from snapping a photo. It was eerie and beautiful in its own way, and I knew it would make a great addition to my collection. I was just turning to leave when I heard it. A whisper, faint and raspy like dry leaves brushing together. "Leave." I froze, staring into the trees, but there was no one there. My pulse quickened as I backed away from the altar, stumbling a little on the uneven ground. I told myself it was just the wind. It had to be the wind. That night, the wind came back. I was editing photos in the RV when I heard it. A soft scratching sound, like claws against metal, My stomach clenched as I turned off the lights, peering through the window. The moon cast long shadows across the ground, but there was nothing there. I stepped outside, armed with my flashlight, and saw the marks. Claw-like scratches raked down the side of the RV. A surge of adrenaline shot through me as I swung the flashlight toward the trees, half expecting to see an animal, a bear, maybe. But the forest was still. Too still. No rustling leaves, no chirping insects. Just silence. My breath fogged in the cold air, and I realized I was trembling. Probably just a raccoon, I muttered, but I didn't believe it. The next morning I told myself I was overreacting. The scratches were weird, sure, but it was the middle of the woods. Animals did strange things. I packed a lunch and decided to hike deeper into the canyon. Maybe I'd find a new trail, something to distract me. The gorge was stunning, its cliffs rising like jagged teeth on either side. The air felt heavy, as if the canyon was holding its breath, but I pushed forward. That's when I started noticing them. Symbols. They were carved into the trees and scratched into the dirt, strange and unfamiliar. At first, I thought they were just graffiti, but they didn't look like anything I'd seen before. They made my skin crawl. The trail led me to a dead end, a sheer drop into the gorge below. As I turned to head back, I heard it again, the whisper. It came from the trees, faint and raspy. Sarah. I froze. My name. It had whispered my name. I practically ran back to the RV, my heart pounding in my chest. When I got inside, I locked the doors and pulled down the blinds, telling myself I was being paranoid. But the fear wouldn't leave me. It sat heavy in my stomach, coiling tighter with every hour that passed. That night, I woke to something worse. It started with the whispers, soft and insistent, coming from all directions. Then came the knocking. Tap, tap, tap on the windows, on the door, on the walls. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it out the window, but the light only seemed to make the shadows move. And then I saw her. She stood at the edge of the firelight, gaunt and impossibly tall, her limbs twisted at unnatural angles. Her face was a patchwork of cracked skin, like porcelain shattered and glued back together. And her eyes, black, empty voids, locked onto mine. The whisper turned into a scream, piercing and relentless, and I stumbled back, clutching my ears. When I looked again, she was gone. The next day, I tried to leave. I packed everything as fast as I could. I was desperate to put miles between me and the gorge, but the RV wouldn't start. The engine sputtered and died no matter how many times I turned the key. I grabbed my pack and started walking, following the road back to the main highway. But every time I thought I was making progress, the path looped back to the gorge. It was impossible, like the forest was twisting itself around me. By the time the sun began to set, I was back at the RV, exhausted and terrified. The final night was the worst. I built a fire, hoping it would keep whatever was out there at bay. It didn't. The whispers started again, louder this time, and the witch appeared just beyond the light. She didn't lunge or attack. She just watched, her cracked face stretching into a horrible grin. and then she spoke. "You let him die, didn't you?" Her voice was a knife, cutting into the guilt I'd tried so hard to bury. "You could have saved him." "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "It wasn't my fault. You failed him." I screamed, grabbing the camera and flipping through my photos, desperate for answers. That's when I saw the altar. The carvings were clear now, showing a ritual, a way to banish her. It required a sacrifice. I grabbed my medical kit, my hands trembling as I pulled out a scalpel. The witch was closer now, her shadow looming over the fire. I took a deep breath, pressed the blade to my palm, and dragged it across the skin. Blood pooled in my hand, warm and sticky, and I smeared it onto the photo of the altar. The air seemed to shatter. The witch screamed, her voice high and shrill, and the fire roared to life. Her form twisted and buckled, pulled toward the gorge as if by invisible chains. I pressed my bleeding hand to the ground, whispering the Latin words I'd seen carved into the stone. "Alum abit, evil begone." The witch collapsed into the earth, her body dissolving into ash, and then, just like that, the forest was still. When the sun rose, the RV started without a problem. I drove until I hit the highway, not daring to look back. The photos I took in the gorge were corrupted, every one of them except for one. It showed the witch standing in the shadows, watching me. I deleted it. I haven't camped alone since. My name is Derek Harrow, and I was 34 when this happened. It was late August 2021, and I had parked my RV in a remote section of Holly River State Park in West Virginia. I was there to film another episode for my YouTube channel, Trail Tales with Derek. You see, I'd quit my corporate job a year earlier and started traveling solo, documenting my adventures. The views paid for the gas, and the quiet helped me forget the life I'd left behind. That's what I told myself anyway. But what happened in Holly River, I'll never forget it, no matter how hard I try. I arrived just before noon. Holly River was breathtaking, with towering trees and streams that glimmered like silver veins in the sunlight. The air smelled clean and earthy, like a promise of peace. I pulled my RV into a spot deep in the park, far from the other campers. I wanted solitude for the footage, and honestly, for myself. The site was perfect, tucked against a hollow surrounded by a thicket of ancient oaks. The moment I stepped out, I felt the stillness, a quiet so deep it pressed against your eardrums. I brushed it off as the charm of being away from civilization. While scouting for shots, I found something strange. A pile of stones near the base of a tree half covered in moss. Among them was an old, scuffed shoe. It was tiny, like it belonged to a child, and the leather was cracked with age. It gave me a weird chill, but I pocketed it for the sake of storytelling. Every mystery needs an artifact, I joked into the camera. I set up my gear, filmed some establishing shots, and cooked a simple dinner. The first night was calm, even peaceful, until it wasn't. I woke up to laughter. At first, I thought it was part of a dream. A high-pitched giggle, the kind of sound kids make when they're playing tag. But it didn't stop. It danced outside my RV, faint and teasing. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, expecting to see campers or maybe a group of teenagers messing around. There was no one. Just trees and shadows. "Hello," I called. My voice echoed back at me. The laughter stopped and the silence rushed in like a weight. The forest didn't feel serene anymore. It felt like it was holding its breath. I shook it off and went back to bed, telling myself it was just my imagination. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt near my RV. They were small, like those of a child, but there were no campsites nearby. The tracks led to the hollow and disappeared. I filmed them for my channel, cracking a nervous joke about ghost kids. The rest of the day felt off. My drone crashed during a flight, even though the conditions were perfect. My camera shut off mid-recording, and my backup batteries drained faster than they should have. And there was this feeling, like I was being watched. I kept turning around, expecting to see someone, but the forest was empty. I started editing footage that evening, hoping the work would calm me down. That's when I noticed it. In one of the clips, as I panned across the hollow, a shadow darted between the trees. It was small, childlike. My stomach dropped. I rewound and watched again. The shadow was there, just for a second, but it was enough to make me lock my RV door before I went to bed. The second night was worse. It started with the laughter again, but this time it was closer, louder. I stayed inside, listening as it circled the RV. Then came the singing. A soft, eerie lullaby. Just a few notes repeated over and over. I turned on every light I had, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. The singing stopped, and I thought it was over, until the knocking started. Tap, tap, tap on the windows, on the door, on the walls. Tiny hands, testing, prodding. I froze, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts. "Go away," I shouted. My voice cracked, weak. The knocking stopped, and the silence returned. The next morning, I decided to leave. This was no ordinary park, no harmless ghost story. Something was wrong with this place. But my RV wouldn't start. The engine whined and sputtered, refusing to turn over. Swearing under my breath, I grabbed my backpack and started hiking to the main road. It was only a couple of miles, or so I thought. No matter which trail I took, I ended up back at the hollow. The trees seemed to shift around me, the paths looping in impossible ways. My GPS was useless. It kept blinking, searching for signal. As the sun dipped lower, I heard it again. The laughter. The singing. It followed me, just out of sight, until I stumbled back to my campsite, exhausted and panicked. That night, I saw them. The children. They came as shadows at first, flickering at the edges of my vision. Then they stepped into the firelight. There were 3 of them, their faces pale and hollowed, their eyes dark voids that seemed to pull the light in. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothes. Ragged dresses, suspenders. One of them pointed at me, and they started whispering. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were rooted to the ground. Then he appeared. The Piper. He was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that bent at strange angles. His face was shrouded in darkness, but I could feel his gaze on me, heavy and cruel. He raised one long, bony hand and beckoned. The children moved closer, their whispers turning into a song, sweet and haunting. I scrambled back, my hands fumbling for the flashlight, the camera. Anything to protect myself. I don't know how I survived that night. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe it was sheer stupid luck, but I remembered the shoe. The artifact I'd taken. Desperate, I threw it into the fire. The flames roared higher, and the children screamed, their voices twisting into something inhuman. The Piper lunged toward me, his hand outstretched, but the fire seemed to hold him back. As the shoe burned, the shadows dissolved, and the forest fell silent. The Piper was gone. When dawn broke, the RV started without a hitch. I drove away, not caring where I ended up, as long as it was far from Holly River. Later, when I reviewed my footage, I found something that chilled me to the bone. In one clip, as I filmed myself walking through the hollow, a figure loomed in the background. A tall, dark shape with unnaturally long limbs. The Piper. I deleted the footage. Some things aren't meant to be shared. I don't camp alone anymore. My name is Jessica Jess Malone, and I was 27 when this happened. It was the summer of 2021, and I was in Greenbrier Valley, West Virginia, filming a documentary on Appalachian folklore. I thought I knew what I was getting into. A little spooky local history, some beautiful landscapes, and maybe a few nervous laughs from my friends. I was wrong. Dead wrong. It all started with Elliot, my best friend since college. Elliot's a big guy with a soft heart and an even softer spot for ghost stories. He's the one who got me into the supernatural in the first place, which is how we ended up planning this trip to the abandoned Greenbrier ghost tracks. He called it the perfect setting for my project. Elliot's girlfriend, Marcy, wasn't so enthusiastic. She's sarcastic to the bone and has a knack for poking holes in everyone's plans. Haunted train tracks? Really? She scoffed when we pitched it. What's next? A seance in the Walmart parking lot? Still, she came along. Probably because she didn't trust us to survive a weekend in the woods without her. Dan and Ruby rounded out the group. Dan's the life of the party, always cracking jokes and pushing boundaries, while Ruby... Well, Ruby's quiet, but she notices everything. I've known her for years, and she's got this sixth sense about people and places. It was Ruby who first warned us that something felt off. We got to the tracks late that afternoon. The forest was thick and green, the air heavy with humidity. The tracks were almost invisible beneath layers of moss and tangled weeds. If you didn't know what you were looking for, you'd miss them entirely. But the locals hadn't forgotten. They called them the ghost tracks because of the Iron Witch, a spirit said to haunt the area. Legend had it she'd been accused of witchcraft and hanged near the tracks in the 1800s. Before she died, she cursed the town, vowing to haunt anyone who trespassed on her land. The legend didn't scare me. It fascinated me. "We're filming history," I said, adjusting my camera as we set up camp. The clearing wasn't ideal. Dan's tent had a broken pole, and Marcy realized she'd forgotten extra flashlight batteries. But it would do. By the time we got a fire going, the sun was dipping below the trees, painting the sky a deep orange. The first sign of trouble came after dinner. We were sitting around the fire, laughing at one of Dan's ridiculous impressions, when the forest went silent. Not gradually like you'd expect when animals settle in for the night, but all at once, like someone had hit a switch. No crickets, no rustling leaves. Just silence. Ruby was the first to speak. "Do you feel that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Feel what?" Dan said, grinning. "The sweet, sweet vibe of nature." Ruby didn't laugh. "Something's wrong," she said. "We're not supposed to be here." Marcy rolled her eyes. "Oh, come on. It's just the woods at night. Stop trying to scare us." But I felt it too, that heavy, oppressive stillness. I tried to brush it off as nerves. I mean, I was the one who dragged us all out here, right? If anyone needed to stay rational, it was me. The second sign came a little after midnight. We were settling into our tents when we heard it. A low, rhythmic hum. Faint but distinct, like the sound of an old train engine in the distance. Dan poked his head out of his tent, grinning. "Is that your ghost train, Jess?" "Probably just the wind," I said, though my voice sounded thin even to me. "Yeah, right. Wind doesn't chugga chugga chew chew," Marcy muttered. Ruby sat bolt upright, clutching her sleeping bag. "It's not wind," she whispered. "It's her." I don't know how long I lay there, staring at the tent ceiling, listening to that sound. It got louder and louder, like the train was barreling straight toward us. And then it stopped. Not faded. Stopped. I scrambled out of my tent, flashlight in hand, and found the others already outside. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the clearing. "What the hell was that?" Elliot asked, his voice shaking. "I don't know," I said. "But we should stay together." Ruby was the first to notice the scratches on the trees. They were deep, jagged marks, like something or someone had taken a blade to the bark. The scratches formed strange symbols, almost like runes. I filmed them. Though my hands were trembling so badly, the footage probably came out useless. "This is messed up," Marcy said, backing away. "We need to leave now." Dan laughed nervously. "What, and miss the big ghost reveal? Come on, Marcy, it's just some local pranksters messing with us." But Ruby shook her head. "No one's been here in years," she said. "This isn't a prank." The third sign came when Marcy disappeared. She'd stormed off after another argument with Elliot, saying she needed some space. We waited, calling her name, but she didn't come back. Finally, Elliot and I grabbed our flashlights and went looking for her, leaving Ruby and Dan by the fire. We found her an hour later, stumbling out of the trees, her arms scratched and bleeding. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. "Marcy, what happened?" I asked, rushing to her side. She looked at me, trembling. "I heard you," she said, calling me. "But it wasn't you. It wasn't you." Back at camp, things went from bad to worse. Dan tried to lighten the mood, cracking jokes about camping with Casper, but even he couldn't hide how scared he was. Ruby sat by the fire, staring into the flames, muttering something under her breath. "What's she doing?" I whispered to Elliot. "Praying, I think," he said. Her grandmother told her about this place, said it was cursed. The attack came just before dawn. We were packing up, ready to leave, when the forest exploded with noise. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, something heavy crashing through the underbrush. And then it hit Dan. I don't know how to describe it. One moment he was standing there, cracking a joke. The next, he was flying backward, slamming into a tree with a sickening crack. He screamed, clutching his leg, which was bent at an unnatural angle. "Get him up," I yelled. But the thing, whatever it was, wasn't done. It circled us, its shadow flickering in the firelight. I caught glimpses of it. Long limbs, pale skin, stretched tight over bones. And a face. God, that face. It wasn't human. Ruby saved us. She grabbed a knife from her bag, slicing her palm and letting her blood drip onto the ground. She chanted something in a language I didn't understand, her voice steady despite the chaos around us. The thing stopped, its head tilting like it was listening. Then it vanished. We carried Dan out of the woods, Marcy supporting one side of him, Elliot and I taking the other. Ruby led the way, her bloody hand pressed to her chest. We didn't stop until we reached the road. Days later, I reviewed the footage. Most of it was unusable. Shaky shots, too dark to see anything. But there was one clip that made my blood run cold. It showed me standing by the fire, filming the group. And behind me, in the shadows, was the figure. It was watching us. I haven't been back to Greenbrier since. I don't think I ever will. But sometimes, late at night, I hear that hum again, the sound of a train that doesn't exist. And I wonder if the Iron Witch is still out there, waiting for her next trespassers. Let me know if you'd like any adjustments or another tale in a similar style.